Today it's Assimilation and Aberrations. Hello, I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter. I'm the author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, I always put my book here in a protective wrapper, grocery sack. Let's see, I'll start that again. I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and bring your own refreshments, a sucker. So today we're doing a bunch of stuff in the book of Samuel. So we're getting back to studying some of the histories, and this is going to be more accessible parts of the Old Testament. We're not getting caught up with prophecies like in Isaiah or Ezekiel, and it's less like reading assembly instructions from IKEA as we get in some parts of the Law of Moses. So this is tragedy. Just like we studied about in the Greeks, we have Samuel's sons, the King Saul, King David, and it's the familiar pattern that you read about in the Book of Ether and the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon is probably the best commentary or companion piece you have to this part of the Old Testament. In fact, the Book of Mormon is the best commentary and companion you have to the entire Bible and to the Doctrine and Covenants. Sorry, my glasses are a little funny right now. There you go. It looks a little bit better now. So let's start out is that we have, we're in the area of Judges, and you have Samuel is, we have the other judges, and like Samson, Deborah, Jephthah, etc. And so right now we have Samuel's one of the judges. And what happened is that just like Eli's sons were problematic, the prophet and the judge Samuel's sons were also problematic. And this is something you see in the Book of Mormon with Alma the Younger. You'll have a person who's righteous, and their children are just real rats. Alma the Younger and the sons of Mosiah is a good example to that. But you also have the same problem in our dispensation, is that the descendants of Joseph Smith just did not catch on with the church and got caught up with the RLDS church, now the Community of Christ, whereas Hiram Smith's children, they stayed aligned with the church. And there's always kind of interesting questions. Why are the children of such faithful people so problematic, turn out to be little rats and weasels? You know, does it have to do with the time spent away from their family? Is the devil attacking them? Does God send special children to faithful men and women so they'll get the best chance possible? Same thing with Lehi, Laman, and Lemuel. I don't know. The time aspect, that may actually be a part of the solution, because you read about that in section 93 at the end of the section, where Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Frederick G. Williams, who are the members of the First Presidency, the entire First Presidency, get called out for neglecting their children. It's a pattern to do, and you have to think through, okay, what's a good strategy when you have a church calling? Are you doing things in your church calling in a way that's not going to hurt your family? So at the same time as that, Eli's sons were just perpetuating the problem, and so the people said, okay, we want to have kings. Now this is something prophesied about in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, and you start with verse 14 to the end of the chapter. As you read in the Book of Mormon, kings are problematic. Even when you have good kings like the two kings, Mosiah and King Benjamin, King Mosiah II points out is that kings are really problematic. And case in point, King Noah, and then you have the entire Book of Ether, which shows the problems of why you don't want to have kings. Then you also have it among the Nephites. You have the problem with Amlici, you have the kingmen, you have Jacob and third Nephi, King Noah, the whole Jaredite experience. And having a king is just not a good idea. And what happens is Samuel warned about them, and you want to read this section, 1 Samuel 8, read it in conjunction with Mosiah 29, and also Doctrine and Covenants, section 134, to get a good feel about political situations. But God says, God tells Samuel, okay, go ahead with the king. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me, God. And so what happens is that Saul is a person selected to be king, and this is done under priesthood supervision. Interesting about Saul is he's from the tribe of Benjamin, which is the smallest tribe, but Saul was actually a very tall person. He was a full head taller than everyone else. And what happens, you read in 1 Samuel section 9, how after he gets anointed as king, the Spirit comes upon him, and he gets the spirit of his calling, that, okay, God's approving of King Saul, that he gets the gifts of the Spirit, he was able to prophesy, and that's a little bit different. Is that you always had kings had a spiritual aspect to them. That's like in the why you have kings always have a group of priests as advisors, and you see the same thing in the Book of Mormon with King Noah, and Alma the Elder is one of King Noah's advisors. And they talk about that a little later on in the history where one of the future kings gets rid of the old advisors, puts a bunch of new ones who are just yes men in. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and. Things go on, but it doesn't take a lot for Samuel to lose his not for Samuel, but for Saul to lose his marvel. Two S's, and it's kind of confusing. So King Saul loses his marvel, and in both cases, it's performing sacrifices. Like I said, kings had priestly function. For example, King Mosiah II, the Book of Mormon, was able to use the seer stone to translate. This wasn't done by a prophet; it was done by the king. But the king was considered a seer in the Book of Mormon times. And it's the you have the same thing in the ancient Israels, that they had the gifts of prophecy, and there's a spiritual component which we don't have. And one of the dangers is reading the U.S. Constitution into the Old Testament, the Bill of Rights, and the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. That doesn't apply to the Old Testament. But what happens is Samuel tells Saul, okay, don't perform sacrifices, and the later thing is don't retain these things. And in the second instance, the first one's in 1 Samuel 13. The second one is 1 Samuel 15. And King Saul disobeys him. And Samuel rebukes him and says, okay, you're not following the directions. You're doing your own problem. You're going off on your own tangents and creating problems by doing that. And, the second time is where you get the famous quote, to obey is better to sacrifice. And let me find it. Is if I can find it, is rebellion is for rebellion is the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as the iniquity of idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected thee from being king. And let's do a little stop right there. Is one of the problems we have is with aberrations is that people get a church calling and they start tweaking around with it and not following counsel, and it creates problem. In fact, it was such a problem, President Thomas S. Monson addressed it. And I'll put links to it in the notes below. I don't know if you know this, is in the comments section, or above the comments sections. I have notes and links to a talk to help round out what we're saying, because this is get to the point where I try and compress things. But President Monson talked about this, that people are just going out there having bishops excommunicating Melchizedek priesthood, which you can't do. And the talk's called Opening Remarks by Thomas S. Monson. It was in conjunction with the release of the one of the new handbooks, the one previous to the one we're using now, the blue one. This is the 2-volume one. The second one was red color, and our new ones are colored blue. They'll do that, but it's screwing up the church. We're having to do problems, and you see this things on the ward level where people just not following directions. For example, I don't know if you knew this. If you go to handbook to the church handbook, read section 30. People are just supposed to have one calling. Go back there and read that. The direction of the church is people are supposed to have one calling in addition to ministering. And what happens is there's a temptation where you have someone who's very capable, you start adding callings onto them. The problem with that is the law of diminishing returns kicks. Well, first of all, it's just disobedience to church council. But the other thing, too, is the law of diminishing returns kicks in, and people just can't handle multiple callings. It's counterproductive, especially with personal discipleship. And I always wonder what would happen if these church leaders would just back off, saying, okay, we're just going to give everyone one calling, and we're just going to downscale what we're doing with the church operations to accommodate this. Remember, it's home-centered church supported. Families are not hiring pools to staff the church machinery. Husband's this, the wife's this, the children are these other callings, and you're just dismembering an active family in order to make the church function. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. Like with King Saul, please follow directions or you're going to get rejected. And follow the handbook. I mean, it happens with other areas, with, for example, quorum size, or who writes the ward history. The ward history is supposed to be written by the clerk, not by any other person. So this process is going on where the Lord rejects King Saul, and 1 Samuel 15:35. And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that, or what it said is, the Lord rent the kingdom from Saul, whom he had made king over Israel. I also made a little mistake. There's a Joseph Smith translation there, And that's the thing to pay attention is when you're reading on your phone, making sure you're catching these. But you just sit there and feel about that. Is Samuel, who wasn't perfect and had problems with his own children, was things just got so out of hand is where Samuel just had to break off the relationship with Saul, saying, "Okay, this is toxic. I'm just withdrawing myself from you, and you're no longer getting guidance from a prophet." And that sometimes happens. Is think about it, sometimes people don't leave the church; they leave a ward, and if you have a ward that has a lot of aberrations going on, people who show up to Sunday school, they just talk about whatever they want to talk about, or in priesthood or whatever, instead of following their revealed curriculum, which is the scriptures. That creates a problem. It's kind of, these people may think they're helping the church out by going off on their own tangent, but they're not. They're actually hurting it. And that's one of the things with a church leader: make sure you're not introducing these aberrations as that Saul was doing. So at the same time, you have the rise of David. He was a young man. Gets called, it's sort of interesting because people think there's three different accounts, or you have three different highlights from King David's life. One is where Samuel goes off and finds the sons, and the Lord looketh upon the heart. We're familiar with that story, and he anoints him. Then later you have is he enters the court because he's such a very good harpist, and he could quell these evil spirits that were afflicting King Saul, which is kind of interesting. That's another thing about the type of music and how music can cast out evil spirits. If you're very depressed, pay attention to the music you're listening to. And then the last thing is you have the famous story with David and Goliath, where David goes in there, and he's just very adept with a slingshot, and he's able with the one sling to at least stun Goliath, and then he had to go there and take Goliath's own sword, just like Nephi took King Laban's own sword and beheaded him. And like I said, I don't think they're disparate accounts. I think they're just three different highlights of there, but we're just never quite sure with it. But that's the rise, and really we've covered the highlights for your own lesson. So just to recap everything is you had a problem. You had this leadership problem that had been going on for several hundred years, because right about this time around 366 BC, so around 400 years after Moses enters the Promised Land, and things just aren't working. So they go to the Israel chooses assimilation, goes with the king option, and you have these really powerful histories about people who have so much promise, and the same thing with King David. So much promise, they disobey and they lose it, and it affects the kingdom. And so let's go to the Christ quotient now. First of all, what are you learning about Jesus Christ as you study the life of Samuel and Saul and David, but also Goliath? We have sort of the rhetorical thing about, okay, what are the Goliathists in your life? And President Mons has talked about that. But you think about that, what Jesus Christ thought about Goliath and about David and about all these people, what you're learning about, that if you can repent when you're introducing aberrations and you're assimilating to the culture, that you can turn to Christ and you can solve the problem where you're no longer going along with the flow or going along with the crowd. And here's another thing to think about too: is as you're reading these, the compare and contrast thing from high school works really well. Where, okay, how does Ruth compare to Hannah? How does King David compare to King Saul and King Noah in the Book of Mormon, or the other Jaredite kings? And that's actually helpful to understand stuff. But make sure you're comparing all these people to Jesus Christ, because we need to follow Jesus Christ, and that's the point.